Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for some of the folks that are joining us from the East Coast. Super excited today. We're going to be talking about how utilities can accelerate their wildfire mitigation planning today. And my name is Arvind Simhadri. I lead the product management at AI Dash on wildfire and storm risk products. Before joining AI Dash, I was at Pacific Gas and Electric, and I was the director of the distribution overhead asset management team, where I developed inspections, maintenance, and asset management strategies, which was focused mainly on the wildfire risk, public safety risk, as well as reliability risk. So I have a awesome group of panelists here, and about um, we're going to talk about a couple of different things. First, what are things that are working in terms of wildfire mitigation planning, and we'll also touch on what are things that may not be working, things that our panelists have seen that we should be doing differently. So without further ado, let me start with introductions for our awesome panelists. Randy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good morning, all. My name is Randy Lyle. I'm principal here at Principal Wildfire Mitigation Practice at AI Dash. My background is 32 years at CAL FIRE, where I was involved in both fire prevention and fire suppression. I left that career at the ripe young age of 50 when I had maxed out the retirement system and went to work at San Diego Gas and Electric Company. There I was involved in the wildfire mitigation program, the response that we had at the company to the 2007 wildfires. I ended up working there for a total of 12 years and then struck out on my own and had a consulting business where I worked creating wildfire mitigation plans, working in the legal arena. And I worked at, just to name a few, I worked at utilities in Mexico, Texas, South Dakota, and then all across the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and happy to be here today. I know I'm going to cut it short so we can move along.
Thanks, Randy. Mason, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Mason Withers. I'm also a principal here at AI Dash. My background is I spent 15 years at San Diego Gas and Electric, and my timing coincided with a lot of exciting things with electric reliability and wildfire risk. So we were part of a team that developed some of the original PSPS programs, some of the original smart trip, fast trip processes. We did mapping. We did all sorts of risk modeling, risk assessment. We were the first to do plenty of stuff through the SMAP and the RAMP process and the filing of the WMPs. So after quite a while of doing that, I thought we kind of reached a level, and I wanted to share what I had learned with other utilities. So I went to third-party consulting with AI Dash, and here we are. We're trying to spread the news, trying to get the knowledge out to the different utilities of what we've seen has worked, including the processes and the tools that are used to get wildfire risk down under control. Thank you, Arvind.
Thanks, Mason. And last but not least, Joe.
Thank you, Arvind. Joe Vaccaro here. My background is almost entirely in the utility space. I spent 42 years with SDG&E along with Enron in the middle there as well, doing 15 different positions across many different disciplines across the utility space. Come to you with a lot of different varying backgrounds of what utilities do, how they do it, etc. Back in 2003, we had a big fire. It was very part of that. We had another big fire that we thought we avoided, the 50-year fire, if you will. We had another one back in 2007. And in 2007, I was asked to head up a wildfire mitigation program for SDG&E. So I have the honor of saying that I wrote the very, very first wildfire mitigation plan. Back then, it was called the Fire Prevention Plan. It was about 110 pages long, never been done before. But from that, the committee, along with the gentleman you've already met, we got together and we started building a world-class program. And I also had the opportunity to teach that world-class program across the world to about 12 to 15 different countries, of which was a very fruitful thing as far as being able to portray the knowledge and give the knowledge out to different utilities across the world. In October of 23, I retired from SDG&E, but very soon after that, I found that my knowledge was very coincident of the need, and it would help in reducing the amount of property damage as well as reducing any potential of life problems. So I joined AI Dash about 4 months ago now. Really excited about it. Working with my ex-colleagues has been fun. Recreating what we've done before, but in a much more interesting sense in that we don't have to do all the issues and problems that we did before. So we already know kind of the pitfalls. We already know what works and what doesn't, and we're happy to help in every way we can. So I think that'll
Thank
do
you,
it,
Joe.
Arvin.
Thank you, Joe. As you all can see, there's a lot of amazing experience here, so I'm excited to get started with the questions. But before that, just want to do a quick housekeeping here. There is a tab at the bottom with Q&A, which says Q&A. Please type your questions in there. We will leave time at the end to go through the questions that are posted in there. All right. My first question, I've been talking to a lot of customers, and one thing that I hear a lot is I'm just getting started. I'm seeing some wildfire risks that are materializing. I need to get started, and I'm starting from scratch. What are some things that I need to put together as my first kind of starting point for a wildfire mitigation plan? Randy, when we start with you, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Arvin. So one of the first things we did at SDG&E after the tragic 2007 wildfire season was assess the landscape. So bringing the GIS and the knowledge that I had from my fire career over, it was fresh at the time. They asked me, can you show us the reddest of the red? Where do we not want to have this happen again in our service area? So in my opinion, a good assessment of the landscape, where the risks are, where the likely consequential ignitions could be. The next thing would be to determine the needs and availability of good situational awareness, meaning basically fire weather, fire danger. I'm talking, I mean, we could talk about a lot of things about situational awareness, but right now I'm specifically talking about when are the bad days. When do we expect that the kinds of days we might want to, let's say, adjust our field practices or our system operations or our settings? So assess the landscape, determine the needs and accessibility for good situational awareness. And then lastly, just super quick, because I know, again, we've got a lot to get to. Consider your own ignition history. What kind of information or data do you have on your own ignitions? There's a strong likelihood that you're not collecting ignition information right now. My suggestion is that you do that, and we have some really good suggestions for doing that. And then I said lastly, but this will be lastly, it would be to query the people that you have in the field. What keeps them up at night? If they have any concerns at all about certain areas or certain kinds of equipment or certain operations, that'd be a really good place to start down the wildfire mitigation program path.
Thanks,
Let me
Randy.
add to that a little bit, Randy, and that
Yeah.
is, to create a team, if you will, an internal team, a cross-divisional team that really starts coordinating all this information so that you have a single source of truth across your company.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So just to summarize, so first, you're saying we need to create a map that tells us where the problem areas are. Secondly, get a situational awareness going so you know what's coming when those bad days are. Thirdly, we're talking about start tracking your ignition data. You need to know when those ignitions are occurring and where. And lastly, you said also take feedback from the folks that are on the ground. Like ask them what keeps you up at night. Awesome. And Joe, thinking about all of this, that's a lot. And you started hitting on this. What are some things that need to be put in place? Maybe you can help us with this, based on your experience. What are some kind of building blocks that need to be put in place to make sure that this doesn't get delayed? Like you can start moving on this fast. Like what are some things that are needed?
No, that's a really good question, Arvin. And what I see really needs to occur is that the company itself has to be able to understand where its strengths are and be able to bring the right team members together so that everybody's on the same page when it comes to what are we trying to accomplish? How are we trying to accomplish it? What kind of data do we have? And what's available to be able to use? And that really is a stressful point because most people just don't have the additional time to do this type of stuff. But it's so important that the utility and the silos within every utility that I've ever been in has kind of developed for itself. You typically have transmission, substation, and distribution. And those are great silos of information, but typically they don't talk that well together. Well, this platform, this program brings them together so that they do start not only talking together, but also to be able to share information, share data, and be able to better coordinate what is next as far as being able to assess the risk.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Mason, did you want to add something here?
Yeah, I do. I think what we're saying here makes complete sense. But another thing to think about is utilities, their job has been to keep the lights on, right? That's the culture, is just keep those lights on. And then, knuckleheads show up from wildfire groups telling them they need to start doing PSPS, they need to like do fast trip on their settings. So the sooner that we can communicate to the entire company that the focus is now not just reliability, it's reliability and wildfire risk, the sooner it would be for everybody to accept what their role is. So yeah, some things that we do in the wildfire space helps reliability, and other things kind of actually harm reliability. And the better we communicate that
Mm-hmm.
while we're doing the things that Randy and Joe were mentioning, I think will help out.
It's a great point, Mason. And I completely agree. You know, in my experience at PG&E, this was one area of wildfire risk management that brought so many teams together. Everybody from, risk, transmission, distribution, operations, inspections, they all had to work together, regulatory team. So yeah, completely agree. Thank you for that. So I want to shift to a different question now. Mason, this one's for you. In terms of every utility that I've talked to, and even PG&E, there's always constraints. You have resource constraints, you have budget constraints. There's so many mitigations you can put in place. How do you decide? How do you know which mitigations are the one that will give the best risk reduction?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that basically every utility needs to think about. Essentially, what you need to do is a kind of a risk assessment. And depending on what you find there with your risk assessment, you need certain levels of granularity or you don't. There's a big difference across the nation in wildfire risk across the utilities. Some utilities literally have billions of dollars of annual wildfire risk, but most utilities are in the like just a few $100,000. So each utility has to do their own risk assessment to figure out where are we on that continuum. Then what you do is you say, okay, let's look at all these mitigations that we could think of, or you can just look at your brother utilities. What did they do? Okay, it could be operational things, it could be system hardening, it could be something around inspections and maintenance. And then what you do is you look to see how effective are those programs for us, and how much does that move the needle for how much risk we have, and then how much are those things going to cost. Now that might sound a little complicated, but you can kind of do it in a qualitative way, or you can do it in a very quantitative way depending upon your risk levels. So what we found, typically operational mitigations such as turning off reclosing, applying fast trip where necessary, not having your crews do work on bad days, things like that, those are the biggest bang for your buck. And so a lot of utilities get a significant amount of risk reduction from doing just those. And the cost of doing those is fairly lower than the others. The next tier is usually things like just improving things that you're already doing, like maybe having slightly better vegetation management, using better tools around vegetation management, having better inspection programs, maybe focusing those programs on the maps areas that Randy was just talking about. And then finally, the system hardening. system hardening can be very expensive, and you want to make sure you're doing the right things in the right places. And so you need to do some risk modeling around how much benefit are we going to get from doing those projects versus how much that they cost. And at some utilities, those things make complete sense. And at a lot of utilities, the amount of capital planning you should do for wildfire is probably a little bit smaller. This is a very big topic, and we could talk about it literally for hours, but I think that's a good overview.
Thanks, Mason. I'm going to try to summarize this. In my mind, I'm thinking about kind of what you mentioned in three different time horizons. You're telling me, short term, Arvind, make sure these are your biggest bang for buck. Make sure you have programs in terms of either shutting down, reclosing, constraining operations in certain days, fast trip setting. These are things that you'll get your biggest bang for buck right away, right? Set those programs up. And just short term, midterm, adjust your inspections program, your veg management program. Make sure you're thinking about wildfire risk when you're creating those programs. And in the long term, that's the system hardening. What are the areas where you may want to do covered conductors, undergrounding, changing of assets? So did I get that right?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, Mason. I want to hit on, let's say we put a lot of these programs in place. Operations is still where everything actually happens on the ground. Joe, wanted to see if you have any thoughts on, while you're putting all these programs in place, how do you make sure you can effectively operationalize all of these programs?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to occur is to have the situational awareness that Randy spoke about very early on in this conversation. If you know what's coming at you, you can react appropriately. But if you don't know what's coming at you, you're just spontaneously trying to do something, anything. So if you have a good situational awareness program, it's going to give you 5, 7, maybe 10 days lookout as to what's happening. And typically we think of it in terms of kind of a 4-step process, and that is normal operations, typically in a green, going to an elevated, which is yellow, kind of slightly elevated, which is you're a little worried about what's coming, but you're not ready to pull the panic button yet. But then you go to an extreme where it's a red flag situation where you get into red flag warnings. And now you've got to be extremely aware of your situation. You need to really be focusing in on your highest risk areas that you've already mapped out. And you be able to give that information not only to the company itself, but the operators to coordinate on. So the entire company is looking at the same thing and being able to understand where they are in the continuum of the risk that is coming at you so that you can appropriately perhaps turn off your reclosing. Maybe you've done that already in the elevated stage. Perhaps you're putting patrols out during a red flag warning stage. There's lots of things that you can do, but you can't do it unless you understand what is the risk at the time you're looking at it. And that piece of it, having the good situational awareness program and being able to in advance decide what are you going to do as that risk elevates through the red flag warning is so key. So I would say being
Yeah,
able to articulate that across the board and in particular to the operators.
great. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I completely agree. Having good situational awareness and then operationalizing with procedures, having good, you know, maybe even dry runs practices of what needs to happen when the red flag warning does show up, or you have a situation that's, you need to take actions. We've been talking a lot about situational awareness. Maybe we dive a little deeper in situational awareness. Randy, I know you've done a lot of work in this space in situational awareness. What are some of the key things um, that you should be monitoring? What are some of the key things that you want to put on your situational awareness dashboard, room, whatever you create? How do you think about that situational awareness?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is key. I mean, this is really it. We want to make good, sound operational decisions based on good intel, especially with regard to the weather components of wind, humidity, temperature is also important, maybe less so than the other. From an operational sense, I think there's two ways to look at the SA. One is kind of the operational sense, which is the like for the forecast of the forecast duration. So the next handful of days, we can plan work in the field or system ops, changes or whatever. Maybe with pretty good confidence, 3, 4, maybe 5 days out. 5 days might be kind of pushy because weather data and weather
Hmm.
forecasts, they just tend to change over time. Certainly the period of that a red flag would be issued. My own personal opinion is every utility ought to have a formal red flag process. And what I mean by that is a way to learn proof positive. I don't mean we got together during the lunch, and saw something about a red flag on TV while we were macking down or whatever. What I'm talking about is a formal process that would allow the utility to ingest information on red flags that affect their service area, and then push or publish that information down through the organization, both to the field and to system operators, so everybody knows we're in a red flag, or when it's going to take effect, when it's going to expire, what we're going to do, and have all of that documented and well laid out. In my opinion, it's the very beginning of a good essay process. And then in the planning sense, and a longer kind of a time duration, it could be months as far as like a long range rainfall patterns that are expected or drought forecasts. So we're looking ahead to next year. We had a minimal rainfall this year. That's what we had here where I live. And we're expecting next year is going to be maybe a critical fire year. So you might want to dust off the public safety power shutoff plan or anything like that. But basically, we need to glean situational awareness, and there's a ton of ways to do that. There's a lot of really good publicly available information, which I'm happy to talk about, but maybe after this or whatever, if anybody has any specific questions. The utilities use proprietary methods, which is what we built at SDG&E, and there's a number of others as well out there that are tuned and suitable for their systems. And then there's also a handful of subscription services that will provide not only good situational awareness at a very granular level, but also provide good operational, let's say, mitigations or suggestions for mitigations that go along with it. So that's a probably decent snapshot there.
Got it. Got it. Thanks, Randy. So one thing you said was 7-day forecast. So it's critical that you're not just looking at what the weather is today. You want to have kind of 5, 7, whatever that is, to start planning. You want to be able to see that weather pattern that's coming in, so you can actually start thinking about doing either recloser changes, your PSPS. Everything takes time. So that I thought was very important. Like, not thinking about just today, tomorrow, but having a good 7-day forecast that will give you early warning that a red flag warning is coming your way. Mason, Joe, did you guys want to add anything?
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I
Mason.
do. All this situational awareness talk, I wanted to give some background about how the risk lies. We did a lot of work in quantitative risk assessments where I've been, and virtually all of your wildfire risk is on just a handful of days a year. It's a slightly different from utility to utility. When we think about things like, we hear the words fire season, or we think of other things, but if you look back at the wildfire history, where the structures have burned, where the acres have burned, they're typically happening, if you have a good situational awareness, they're happening on those yellow and red days, and predominantly the red days. So the more situational awareness you have, it gives the operators, it gives the company, it gives the community trust that when it's a green day, you really don't have to, it's kind of business as usual. But those yellow and red days, that's when you need to step up your focus. When utilities are first starting out and they're thinking about wildfire, they kind of think that wildfire is everywhere. It's behind the corner. It's going to come get me at any time. But the situational awareness really helps you focus when those activities should be. It's not a general rule, but well over 80% of wildfire risk is on a very limited number of days throughout the year. And if your situational awareness is good, you will be able to focus on those days. And the rest of the year, you can, relatively take breaths and do your normal work.
Let me
Very
add
good.
one more thing to that, Mason, and that is When I think of situational awareness, of course, I think of the weather and what's coming at us and where is it coming at us. But also to layer on top of that, where is the risk? Where is your mapping? What have you done to look at the topography and the fuels availability? And where are your lines in coincident with that so that you can then take the situational awareness and apply it to those areas specifically? Because like Mason said, for the most part, you're not going to be widespread. You're going to be pretty dialed down into certain areas of your service territory. And having that situational awareness along with the mapping of your system will give you that great awareness and hopefully some comfort.
Yeah,
Great.
one last thing real quick, Arlen, if you
Go
don't
ahead.
mind.
Yeah.
I think here's what all that kind of adds up to me, and I hope this makes sense to the folks that are listening. Where you've got your red areas on the map and you've got red days, with respect to situational awareness to bad weather days. Don't do stupid stuff on bad days, if you will. You might add a little bit to that. Don't do stupid stuff on bad days in bad areas. That's it. That's what it kind of adds up to. It really is. I know it's a little silly, but there's nothing about it that's not true.
Great. You know, kind of following up along this line, Randy, you know, what I've seen is it's not just the utility itself trying to do this mitigation. You gotta have folks that are first responders, folks that are doing a lot of other things in the community, all come together to kind of have a good, effective wildfire mitigation plan. Maybe can you give some thoughts on like what are some of the key stakeholders that utilities should be thinking about building relationship with so you can have an effective mitigation plan?
Yeah, I'll kick this one off, and the other guys will want to kick in too or chime in, and they should. The I can tell you that we were successful. I'm going to say we were successful. I will assert to you that we were successful at SDG&E with our wildfire mitigation program. So if we go from the fact that I think we were successful with it. One of the reasons is that we built strong relationships with local first responders, mainly the fire department, because we're talking about fire in the first place. And when I say the fire department, I mainly mean the wildland fire agency. So for many folks here on the call, it'll be an agency like CAL FIRE or the U.S. Forest Service or the BIA BLM National Park Service. So the feds, the federal agencies. Um, all of those folks can step up and be the utilities advocates when it comes down when push comes to shove and there's regulation, maybe pending, and we need advocates or voices that stand up. So we did. I would like to say we did a really good job of building those relationships. The next layer would be other first responders like law enforcement. One might say, what's law enforcement got to do with wildfire or utility operations? But when we get all the way down to public safety power shutoffs, and I know that's going to be a big leap for a lot of folks here, but it's probably common at one point or another. We want them on our side as well. And at the same time, local and state governmental cooperators. So we interfaced a lot with other critical infrastructure providers. So think water and sewer, hospitals, those kinds of partnerships that when things go bad, or even if we're just changing recloser or settings, if it's going to affect you, let's talk about how we can ameliorate some of those effects that we're likely going to have on you in the name of wildfire safety. So it really talks, well, it kind of creeps into a thing that we think of as a fire safe culture. But let me end there and let the other guys um, chime in. Oh, does that work?
Well, since I've got my mic on, I'll chime in first, Randy. I think you've hit it right on the head. We did a lot of work. I want to say 3 or 4 years worth of work developing relationship with the first responders. But we also started thinking, what else can we do? And one of the things that we keyed on probably later than we should have and that was customer contact. We needed to be able to reach out to the customers and have them better understand what we were doing, why we were doing it, and how we were doing it. So we did a number of fairs in the backcountry, in particular in those really red, tenuous areas, to give them the opportunity to interface with the people that were doing the work at the utility and give them comfort as to what was going on and how it was happening. One of the things that really turned in my mind was some ladies would come up to me and ask me about the PSPS events. But by the time I explained to them that we were shutting off so that you wouldn't lose your home, all of a sudden the light bulbs started going off. So to be able to reach out to your customers and really help them understand the problems involved and give them an understanding as to what we were doing significantly helped our customer base and our appreciation within the city of San Diego. The other thing I wanted to just mention is the regulators. The regulators really are kind of stumbling a little bit in a lot of different states. They're being pressed to do legislation. And if the utilities can reach out to them and kind of go hand in hand rather than head to head, that will significantly help the development of the legislation. And finally, I want to mention the insurance folks. The insurance folks are very leery about what's going on, and the better they understand the program, the depth of the program, the complexity of what's going on, that kind of handle that you have, the better it'll be for your overall insurance as well. Mason?
I think you guys hit it really well. We have that group of folks called stakeholders, and this is just anybody who's directly related to wildfire risk with the utility. It could be regulators, it could be the government, it can be customers. When you do certain things, you want to reach out to, which schools are going to be affected, which hospitals are going to be affected, knowing who's in your red areas that you might be turning reclosing off more frequently or even doing PSPS. So I think the other guys hit it really well. Just communicate, and that will help very much.
That's good.
Great. No, that was really good discussion. Yeah, and one, I'm trying to think about, in terms of something that you hit on, Randy, when we first started this discussion was collect your ignition data. I wanted to go back a little bit to, you know, there's a lot of data that we could collect, working in a utility, for example. What are some key data sets that, maybe Joe, you can start on this too, whoever wants to chime in. What are some key data sets that are important for utilities to start collecting when they want to start putting together a good data-driven wildfire mitigation plan?
Randy, do you want to start and I'll jump in?
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, it goes without saying if the utility has been collecting either ignition or near ignition data thermal events, that would be the logical place to start so that we're, making prioritizations and mitigation decisions based on information, not just anecdotes. Um, Typically, the outage management system is there can be some nuggets kind of hidden and embedded there that can be teased out. Lots of times there's a mention of fire or heat, like burning, charring, smoking, melting, crispiness, the tracking, those kinds of things would indicate that at that outage there was a thermal event that could have been an ignition, maybe on the right day in the right place, could have been a bad ignition. So that kind of data is super important. And then I think just the notion of outage information in general to give a sense, absent better stuff, to give a sense of where the worst performing feeders and how do they align with that risk landscape that we've already mapped out. So we get same thing. We get frequent flyers, so to speak, in bad areas. That's probably a place to prioritize some of our efforts. Those are what seem to make sense to me. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I want to mention that one of the last things I did with SDG&E was create a measures and metrics department. And what I found was that the utility is super data rich. All the utilities I've worked with, super data rich. Problem is, it's not very well organized, or some of the data isn't well defined. And as a result, you had to make sure that what you were looking at was consistent on a definitional basis. And let me give you one example. One example I found was that we started tracking wire downs. Well, in that time, we were looking at wire that actually hit the ground. And we measured them and we kept track of them and how many. But then somewhere in the middle there, the engineers in the distribution area decided that a wire down was any wire that had skipped its mooring point. So say a lashing wire broke off an insulator and now the wire is sitting on the crossarm. They considered that a wire down. And all of a sudden our wire down numbers radically increased. And everybody started panicking, like, why is this happening all of a sudden? So you need to be careful as to when you're collecting the data, and the data is very, very important because it leads you to the areas that you need to pay attention to. But you need to make sure that the definitions that you're using are consistent across the board. And then as far as the depth and breadth of the data, you typically have silos of transmission, substation, and distribution. Those silos need to come together in a single place so that you can look at all the data and say, okay, we're having distribution outages. What's going on the transmission side? Are we getting trips and targets on the transmission side? Is something significantly wrong in this part of the area or the system? So looking at the data with criticality that you can use and then start trending, now you're going to be able to look at the mitigations and say, hey, we should do mitigations on this particular area or this particular function because that's where the best bang for the buck on risk mitigation will be. So the collection of the data, the centralization of the data, being able to define it, the processes, procedures, all very important. Probably way deeper than we need to go right now, but that's kind of where the data is going.
Yeah, and I'll add just real briefly. Most utilities are collecting outage data and they have asset management data, but the better that can be focused specifically on the exact location where the outages occur will help actually with ignitions. There's a strong relationship between ignitions and outages. And so some utilities are only collecting that, yeah, there was an outage downstream of this isolating device. That could be helpful, but maybe there's a mile or two of things downstream of the isolated device. So the more clarity you can have on the exact location of where the outage occurred will help future generations of data analysts help you solve wildfire issues. And then on the asset management side, obviously you guys know the better the data is there, the age of the equipment, the specific nature of the equipment is known, the better also that future groups will be able to analyze the data better.
Thank you all. Okay, can you guys hear me? Sorry, I got dropped for a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right. Great. So, in terms of all this data that, you've gathered, you started to kind of put together your plans. One thing I wanted to discuss also was about how do you effectively communicate, internally within the company to make sure right things are getting prioritized, you're showing the right data to the right leadership teams, and with regulators. Like, what type of cadence have you seen has been effective in terms of communicating with regulators? Just give some ideas on good communication strategies internally and externally.
Well, I think the regulatory part, it kind of depends on what the regulatory procedures are. If there isn't any proceedings going on, it's difficult to get in front of the regulators too often. So it's a little bit of a flex question there, but it's like, again, communicate as often as you can, but do it in a high level way that, people with different expertise can understand. You don't want to overload them with that information. I think internally, the key to that is, like we were saying, if you have an organization within your company that's wildfire focused, that has arms inside of many different groups, then those folks can talk regularly, and then they can farm the information out to their troops when they're having their weekly reports or whatever it would happen to be. So the more department communication you can have is good, but having a central group of leaders in the wildfire team do that is critical. You wouldn't expect one department to lead the entire thing by themselves.
Good point, Mason. And I'm going to go back again to what I've developed with SDG&E. And we actually got the data to a point where we were able to put it on a app on a phone. So all the information, all the data was coming in a central collection, uh, the situation where we could then call it up on a phone. So any executive or director or even a field manager could call up the information and have that information, the same information as everybody else. That information was updated every week. And no, I'm not suggesting that that has to be done right away. But boy, when you get to that sophistication point, now you reduce the amount of confusion, you reduce the amount of consternation between different departments. An executive may call an engineer in the field on Monday and get one answer. Another executive will call that same individual, say on Thursday, 4 days have passed, progress has been made on a project, and now the answer is different. And now the executives are talking and they're having consternation between themselves because they're not having the same information. So having a central place where you have consistent and same information, super critical and key to really driving the whole focus of the effort and the company ahead.
That's a great point. And, just drawing on a little bit of my experience at PG&E also, one of the big things for wildfire mitigation planning is how do you define the risk? Getting alignment across the company on what is it, a ignition risk, a wildfire risk, what is the likelihood, what is the consequence? If everybody's talking in the same language, that makes things run a lot more smoother versus, having silos with, different uh, thought process on how to assess wildfire risk. I'm seeing a lot of good questions in chat, so I'm thinking maybe this is a good time I jump to some of the questions that folks in the audience have been asking. Give me a second. So the first question, um, for the East Coast utilities, with predominantly deciduous forest cover, what mitigation strategies do you find have the best value? And does the lower wildfire risk in these areas justify considerable efforts in the mitigation space? Mason, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think we kind of talked about that earlier. We have worked with utilities in those type of the deciduous forests, on the East Coast in the central areas. You're right. You won't have as much justification for doing extensively large wildfire programs. I think some utilities that are in the wildfire space are going around talking about all these great things they're doing, and that's great for them. That doesn't mean everybody has to do what they're doing. So I think going back to points that we've made in the past, operational things are very important. In some of the areas that we've seen, I'll say east of the Mississippi, just loosely, wildfire risk is actually fairly low unless you're in certain like drought conditions. So if you're not in a long-term drying period, you're pretty much fine. And so if you can monitor that drought, then you take your actions when those come in. We wouldn't expect a lot of like undergrounding or really intensive cover conductor programs on the East Coast. That's just not what we see, but really good vegetation management programs, knowing where to target your dollars on those vegetation programs, specifically the intersection between if you do have mapped areas and your situation awareness is getting to the yellow or red if you're in drought. You can actually pre-trim some areas if you have a week in advance, or you just know these are the areas that we should be looking at. There's different tools out there that can do that. So again, operational first, veg management second, inspections third, and the other stuff would come well after that. Without having all the details, we need to know more, but that's kind of a general rule for a lot of the utilities in the East.
Well, and I'd be also looking at the data itself, Mason, that if you're getting a lot of ignitions because of trees or because of forest, that kind of thing, then you really need to kind of look at your lines itself and figure out, do we need to do more trimming in those areas, or are we okay as far as being able to assess the risk? So having that mapping, having the situational awareness, and then looking at the overall risk as far as trees and vegetation goes, pretty key.
Last thing for me on this maybe is that I think that utilities and their insurers and regulators can sometimes have varying opinions on the level of risk and the right amount of mitigation strategies to apply to that risk. And I think that utilities need to consider their regulatory and their insurance environment, which may tend to be, I'm just saying, may tend in some cases to be a little, I don't know, paranoid maybe is a good word, or maybe a little overreactive. Going to have to be responsive to those things regardless. So the creation of a sound wildfire mitigation strategy that's specific to your locale is probably a really good first step.
Great. All right, I want to go to the next question. What's your guidance on how utilities that may be juggling multiple climate risks? So in addition to wildfire, there is hurricanes, storms, other major events that happen very frequently in this service area. What are your thoughts on, how utilities should be kind of prioritizing across all of these?
Well, I think you can take a all hazards approach, Arvin, that you look at wildfire, and of course you got your situational awareness and your risk development and your mapping for wildfire. But you may also want to consider, say, for a hurricane, what are the areas of your service territory that are going to be negatively affected by that hurricane, and do a similar operational plan to develop what are you going to do if a hurricane comes in. And if you have the situational awareness, you can do that, plan for it, and be ready for it rather than just reacting to it.
So I think if we look at the risks of resilience, reliability, wildfire all at the same time, it seems overwhelming. But there are quantitative ways to sort of assess the impacts of each of those in quantitative ways, so you can numerically make a business case for where you should be doing things. So for example, maybe you have hurricanes hitting your area every so often, and you're trying to rebuild those areas. If they also overlap with wildfire, you can add that to the case to say, look, maybe on its own, the hurricane resilience isn't quite enough for that area, but when you add in wildfire or reliability, it gets to go above and beyond that. So it's not necessarily a question of prioritizing, it's a question of just considering all the negatives that you can have from reliability, resilience, and wildfire, and adding them together in a quantitative way and packaging that together. And in the end, hopefully you get the story that you all kind of internally feel that's what it should be, but now you have a numerical way to support that.
Yeah. Get those, yeah, sure. Get those solutions, identify the problems and get the solutions, figure where there can be collaboration and leveraging between them, and it would seem like some certain solutions would certainly, bubble up to the top and be far more effective and both cost effective and operationally effective, that you could apply to multiple wounds, so to speak.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm thinking about, for wildfire, we talked about the 7-day forecast, like what's the weather pattern coming in. But that same situational awareness applies to your hurricanes, your storms, what do you forecast coming in your territory for the next 7 days, right? You might have different operational plans for a wildfire versus storm versus, a thunderstorm or hurricane, but being able to track it all together makes a lot of sense. I want to talk about the next question here, which is a good one. What is your definition of success for a utility regarding wildfire? How do you guys think about that?
Yeah, thanks. I saw that come in. That's a really good question, and of course, it could go in a lot of different ways. Here's my response real quick. Obviously, an overall reduction in ignitions or ignition potential, but I mean, you can stop right there and say, okay, well, we did our job, we did a good job. But what about things like customer or member buy-in for the co-ops? What about incremental increases in the components that make up a good wildfire mitigation, either program, plan, or strategy, whatever you want to call it? So if we start with a red flag program, let's just say a red flag process, like I talked about earlier, that's success. That's a good start, and that in and of itself is a good success. And then we add to that situational awareness. And then what about considering? I think it's success if we begin to make more informed expenditures based on either our strategic vision of where we want to go, and the data that we've collected or gleaned or harvested out of what we're already collecting. And then I got to thinking, how could you kind of sum that up in sort of a clever way, if you want to think like that? And I think in a word, it would be to get started. If you get started down this path, you've already been successful. You've shifted from the inertia. I don't mean to imply nobody's doing anything, but you've shifted from inertia to momentum, and I personally think that that's a success.
Agreed. And I always talk about it in terms of a sprint versus a marathon. This is definitely a marathon. You can hustle
Yeah.
and work, your tail off and get everybody all upset and excited about creation of a wildfire mitigation plan, but that's just the very beginning. And that wildfire mitigation plan will evolve and strengthen and expand over time. So just realize that this is just a starting point, but let's get out of the gate. Let's make sure that we're doing what we can, being aware of what we can, and putting in place the operational practices needed in order to make a safer system.
I'll
Great.
really quickly
Yeah.
add that success is also, unfortunately, in the utility world, success is also getting the commission to allow you to, fund your program. So if you have a really good case for a WMP and you get funding for it, that's a lot of success. Some utilities don't even get to that point. They know what they want to do, but they just can't convince the commissioners to help them pay for it, and so then it becomes sticky.
Yeah. I missed this question in chat. Joey, when you were talking about, red flag days show up, and you mentioned that we should be doing patrols during a red flag day. Can you talk a bit more, Joey, like if you feel folks patrol, flag warning is about to show up, or
Arvin,
you are in red flag days? Go ahead.
Arvin, you kind of broke up, but I think you just want me to explain a little bit more on the patrol work that I mentioned earlier, and
Yes.
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
Patrols are used as a way to kind of double check things. If you've got a red flag warning and you know you're in a tenuous area of your system, it's red, as far as risk goes, then you'd probably want to take qualified electrical workers or um, um, vegetation workers and just have them do a patrol of the area just to see, is everything up in the air correctly? Are trees leaning into the lines already before the event? And do you have time to go out there and perhaps do some preventative trimming or maybe a fix or something like that, so that when the weather does come through, you've already cleared most of the issues? And typically during a red flag warning, you're laying up your crews anyway. You're not having them do any particular work unless it's an emergency. So it's a good value of the crew work that you have available to you. So to be able to have kind of eyes on, if you will, and give that kind of information back to your emergency operations center as to, we just checked this entire circuit, is all okay, or we found some trees, we're going to trim them over the next couple hours before, 2 days before it happens. It just gives more confidence that we have a handle on the system and that things won't fall apart as quickly as it could have. So patrols are a very effective use of laid up crews during red flag days.
Great. All right. We have 5 minutes left. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for Mason, Joe, Randy, you guys to kind of just give us some thoughts on, like, what are some of your key takeaways? Like, what are some things that folks can start putting in action today when they're thinking about wildfire mitigation planning? Mason, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Arvin. It's been a wonderful opportunity to speak to all of you. Hopefully, this isn't the last time we engage. I think what we've seen and we're talking about with the questions is generally every utility is slightly different. Don't necessarily look to the other utilities for exactly what they did because you're different. Do a risk assessment, get your situational awareness in line, get a map made, talk to folks who have some experience, and you can overcome the issue. I saw a question about how utilities could deal with fire for the long term. The point is just don't do bad stuff on bad days and you'll be pretty well. And if you can focus on doing that first, the rest of it will come easy. I know it sounds easy for me to say, but there is a plan. And if you stick to it, you'll be a lot better off than maybe your concerns are right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Mason. Randy?
Arvin, I think one of the first things, seriously, one of the first things I learned when I left SDG&E and went out on my own was that everybody doesn't need a California-sized approach. Okay. And so it just makes sense to, really what Mason just said, assess your own risks, tailor your mitigations to your service area and your appetite for risk and your tolerance for damage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the environment where you live and work and operate, and make it make sense for you. And although when the executives from these these big, rich, wealthy, let's say well-resourced, I'm not casting aspersions here. I don't think that. I have no idea who's online. When they get together and talk about the high-end solutions that they are employing, that's really good. And it's good that they're sharing, but some of those solutions may not be necessary for smaller, less risky, less well-resourced co-ops. And so I think make it make sense for you and the people that you serve, and that's a really good success and a good starting place as well.
And I'd
Thank you,
like to
Andy.
add that,
Joe?
again, thank you for the opportunity to be in front of all you. Hopefully you've gleaned some information and knowledge. But the other thing that I want to mention is because we're almost all interconnected with either different systems, different co-ops, different IOUs, you must consider who you're interconnected to and are you coincidentally operating in the same kind of manner? Because if you're operating in one regard and your interconnection is in a different regard, it's going to cause issues. So you got to be able to open up and talk to the people or the entities that you're interconnected with in order to have mutual success.
Thank you, Joe. This has been amazing. It's been an honor to have you guys gonna be on this panel and do this in front of all the folks here. And if you guys have more questions, there's a link in chat that has been put there where you can learn more about the wildfire mitigation planning services. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. And I get to ask Randy, Joe, Mason questions pretty much every day. And sometimes they're like, Arvind, you gotta leave me alone now. I gotta do work too. But this has been great that we get to ask these questions in front of everyone, and you get to share this information, critical information, with everyone. So thank you all. I really appreciate you all joining the time out of your work day, and hope this was helpful for everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Arvin.